Today's presenter is going to be Dr. Jill Hough. Jill is the program director at CERTC, which is a small urban and rural transit center, and that's a part of the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at the North Dakota State University. Jill has more than 20 years of transportation experience, and that includes publishing more than 50 papers and reports. She currently teaches a graduate course on transportation at NDSU and is also developing a course in leadership, ethics, and academic conduct for next spring. She's the chair of APTA's Higher Education Committee and the vice chair of TRB's Rural and Inner City Bus Committee. She has testified on rural livability for DOT's Transportation Reauthorization Outreach Tour, as well as in front of the Senate Budget Committee on infrastructure in rural areas with a focus on older adult mobility. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jill to begin our presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Jess. Welcome to everyone. I'm so glad that you are taking time today to be part of this one-hour webinar when we take a look at ethics. There's actually so much that we could cover that we could literally spend months discussing ethics. And as was said, I am developing a course that will be taught next spring looking at leadership ethics and academic conduct. Today I hope this webinar really brings a greater consciousness of ethics to you and your agency, and that you can come away with some tools to guide you in your decision making. Sometimes your decisions aren't going to just be between right and wrong, but they're going to be between right and trying to come up with the best solution. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about two worldly philosophers. So if you go ahead and please next slide. Okay, some of you may be aware of Calvin and Hobbes. You may not have known that they were worldly philosophers, but when you take a look at this, you have Calvin who's saying, I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justifies the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. Calvin continues, it's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not. And then we see Hobbes push Calvin, and there's a, hey, Calvin, what'd you do that? Hobbes, you were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justifies the means. Calvin, I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me. And Hobbes wanders off. You know, it's sad to say that too many times this is happening in our society where people want to live their own way. And you probably saw on the news yesterday, which was very disappointing to see the young congressman from Illinois who was the youngest to enter Congress at 27 and probably the youngest to resign at 33. And resigned due to ethics investigations, really which showed poor choices on his part, and not only impacts him, but the people that he was representing. So our decisions and making ethical decisions are really important. Next slide, please. So with you attending this today, what I ask you is how would you describe the state of ethics in your in transit today, and specifically in your agency or your office? Would you say it's excellent? Would you say it's outstanding? Or would you say it's needing help? That's something for you to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So exactly what are ethics? What is ethics? Is it something tangible? Can you recognize it? Or is it, you know, you recognize it when you see it, as Justice Potter Stewart said about pornography. But how do you define ethics? When we take a look at the next slide, we see the actual definition of ethics. And that is, it's the discipline dealing with what's good and bad, and with moral duty and obligation. And then we have to hit it again. There we go. It's a set of moral principles, a theory or system of moral values. And then third, the principle of conduct governing an individual or a group. The word ethics was really, in the Greek, it's ethos. And ethos means character. So one way to think of it as, also think of it as behavior. I thought about character. Character is really how you're known. You know, people will talk about somebody's character traits, or they may even say he's such a character, but oftentimes people will know you by your character. And I had read a quote one time that said, character follows you after the grave. So even after you're buried, people remember you by your character. So just something to keep in mind. Let's take a quick look at developing our ethics. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to see how do we develop our ethics. Okay, family is one of the ways. I want to say a late Harvard psychologist, Lawrence Kohlberg, some of you may have heard of him, he conducted a lot of research in this topic area and how we develop ethics, and he found that a person's ability to deal with moral issues is not formed all at once. And just as there are stages in your growth and physical development, the ability to think morally also develops in stages. So here, family, the very first stage, a child defines right and wrong in terms of what authority figures say is right or wrong. And, you know, you think about that in rewards and punishments. Your parents tell you stealing is wrong. Then you go into the second level of moral development. And the second level of moral development is really the level that most adolescents reach. Kohlberg called it the conventional level. And it's really when you internalize the norms of those groups with whom you live or who you're associated with. Your right and wrong is really based more in terms of your loyalties to your family and your friends. And they tend to answer in terms of what families have taught. You know, you may think, well, my mom would always say. And so, and that also is an education. You can learn about it. But then the third area, if a person continues to develop morally, they'll reach what Kohlberg labeled the post-conventional level. And that person that's at the post-conventional level stops defining right and wrong just in terms of group loyalty or norms, but instead what they do is they look at it at the adult. The level develops moral principles that define right and wrong from a more universal point of view. And the moral principle of the post-conventional person would really appeal to any, we would say, any reasonable person because they take everyone's interest into account. And if you click on it, there should be workplace should show up, the next bar. Thank you. If you ask a person at the post-conventional level why something is right or wrong, what they're really going to do is they're going to appeal to what promotes or doesn't promote the universal idea of justice or what is right. And so we see that hopefully people develop, and even as they go through the educational system, it can be pointed out to them to not just look at what family and friends say. Of course, that's important, but taking a look at groups as a whole, and then hopefully that can also be reflected in the workplace. Next slide, please. So we take a look at how we develop them, but there seems to be a growing trend of ethical violations through the years. And so I ask you, do ethical violations occur in the workplace? And of course, they do. Have you experienced them? Yes or no? They happen in government. They happen in business. They happen pretty much everywhere. I think about there can be the small things and there can be large things. Think about maybe times somebody pointed it out to you. I think years ago when I was working as a server at a restaurant, the owner called a meeting and asked everyone to check their home for their pens. They said all the pens were disappearing and that you taking them from the restaurant, even not knowingly that you're taking them with you, that was stealing. So it really comes in all forms. On a good note, the Ethics Resource Center has been really looking into workplace ethics, and they've noticed that since 2007, the case of ethical reports has gone down, where it seems as though people are acting more ethical. And some of the reasons can be when you're in a tighter economy, people start watching things more closely, or people are let go. But there shows that there's still really a ways to go. as I mentioned, the growing trend, we had the Bernie Madoff, the Ponzi scheme that was in the news for a long time. If you think of also Jack Abramoff, who was the D.C. lobbyist, who back in, I remember seeing him in 2012 doing a 60 Minutes commercial, or 60 Minutes program, I should say. And he said that he thought he was the most moral lobbyist that there was, and he ended up going to prison for a few years. But one of the things that he also said, he thought he was a good person because he donated 80% of all of his profits to charity, yet what he was doing was wrong. We hear about the large cases in the news, but what about the smaller cases that really go unreported or unnoticed? On the next slide, we're going to take a look at a real simple example. Let's say, what does it cost a company or an agency if people return late from lunch? Let's just say you have an organization of 100 people, and they earn on average $40,000 a year. Okay, let's say that they return from lunch or a break just 10 minutes late, 2 to 3 times per week. What does that cost? When you look at the financial impact, it's it ranges between $33,332 to about $50,000. Or when you put that in terms of rides, and I used the price point of $14 per ride just because when looking at the Real Transit Fact Book, 50% operating costs were $14 or lower. And when you put this in that context, that's, almost 2,400 rides, all the way up to 3,571 rides. It seems so simplistic, but when you think about that impact on an agency, it's really huge, or the people who would not be getting rides because of this. So let's take a look at the next slide. Talks about, really why being ethical. Sorry, I put this little show in there, I guess. Here we go. Why be ethical? We have the fiscal responsibility, moral obligation. Since we're dealing with public goods and there's limited resources, it's really important to have that fiscal responsibility. There's studies that show that customers choose and appreciate ethics. They'll go back to an organization, a business, because of the ethical treatment. And also, studies also show that employees are more loyal to an ethical company. So, and we as humans do have that moral responsibility. If we go ahead and go to the next slide, please, we'll see that ethics are really crucial in transportation in the workplace. And you know this because we really work with the public good, and we need to manage the resources accordingly. Ethical choices in transportation are definitely paramount because of the lack of fiscal resources available to meet the growing demand. I mean, we see this with transportation authorization, the legislation taking a long time, really needing the funds. So we need to show that we can manage our funds appropriately. The next slide points out something that Jim Krumpacker, he wrote an article on fostering a culture of ethics. And he mentioned that establishing and maintaining strong moral standards in the workplace are essential to building public trust and delivering the transportation program effectively. So it's so important that agencies are doing this and that they're adhering to ethical rules. Now, you can't just in your agency say, we're ethical and because we have a code of ethics. And this next slide is going to be clear about this, because you can have one, but it's not necessarily always followed. If you see this, you're going to the code of ethics. This is pretty funny for those of you who remember Enron. As officers in Enron Corp, its subsidiaries and its affiliated companies were responsible for conducting the business and affairs of the companies in accordance with all applicable laws and in a moral and honest manner. We want to be proud of Enron and know that it enjoys a reputation of fairness and honesty that is respected. Kenneth Lay. Okay, hopefully some of you are kind of smirking at what happened with Enron because it was very awful. Even though they had this code of ethics. So although I encourage you to have a code of ethics, I encourage you to uphold it. Next slide. We'll take one more. I want to look at one more quick quote before we start getting into some of the tests we're going to look at. Warren Buffett, okay, so many people know him, Oracle of Value-Based Leadership. Here's what he said to a congressional committee. I want employees to ask themselves whether they are willing to have any contemplated act appear on the front page of the local paper the next day to be read by their spouses, children, and friends. If they follow this test, they will not fear my other message to them. And this was his other message. Lose money for my firm, and I will be understanding. Lose a shred of reputation for the firm, and I will be ruthless. I think that's a very good quote, and something that would be nice if we would have our public officials and also if we would have our transit agency say. Next slide, when you take a look at this, you see I'm asking, can ethics be taught? Some people think yes, some people think no. As we saw earlier, it can really happen in stages, in phases, as Kohlberg showed us, the Harvard psychologist. When you take a look at this, you know, the question is, how important are ethics in today's society? If you look at this real closely, you notice these people are cheating, okay? So definitely that is not a good thing. But another thing I just want to caution everyone about and to take into consideration that many people think that they're very righteous and that they will always make the right decision. And the word of caution is brought up because of some of the things that I was reading when Chuck Colson, some of you know of him, who was in the Nixon administration, and he went to prison over Watergate, the Watergate scandal. He thought he was a very good person. He was a hotshot, you know, lobbyist in Washington, D.C. when he was asked to join the administration. He thought he was above, you know, he would not do anything wrong. He told his lobbyist friends to not come ask for favors. But he, in the end, was compromised. And there was a quote by Reverend Billy Graham that said, we all have a little bit of Watergate in us. So it's important to always keep ourselves in check, even when we think that we can't be harmed by it. So how can we guard ourselves or check ourselves so we do not make unethical decisions? I think it's important to realize we're all going to face ethical dilemmas. They are unavoidable. Anticipate them and prepare yourself for them. If you can anticipate, you can prepare for them. Let's go to the next slide. So the question is, how do we apply ethics to situations or circumstances? There are some different standards and tests that exist. I want you to just think of your own situation. We're going to go through and we're going to apply. I have one specific example, but I want you, if you have a notepad and paper, to write down a situation that you want to apply these tests to. The example that we're going to take a look at deals with padding expenses. This one is very, this example I'm using because it's something that seems to be happening all over. I've spoken with engineers. This was an issue that they had to deal with and wanted this looked at. So it's a huge issue. So what we're going to talk about is there's an individual who is a sales associate. You know, they could be working for a large bus manufacturing agency. They could be another salesperson. But after completing, there's a new, this new person who's on board. And after completing her sales and ethics training with her new employer, Jane was assigned to work as a trainee under Anne, okay? So Jane is the new person, Anne is the senior person. So keep that in mind. And Anne, who is the senior person, she is one of the most productive people. And at the end of the first week, Jane and Anne were sitting and they were trying to work out and fill out their expense vouchers for the week. And Jane then remarked to Anne that in her training, they had stressed the importance of accurately reporting all expenses. At that time, then, Anne seemed to launch, she got into this long explanation of how the company's expenses, their whole reporting procedure really resulted in underpayment of the actual costs that the reps incurred. And she let Jane know that all of the sales in this area on the East Coast, sales reps made up the difference by padding all of their receipts that were under $25 because no receipts were required. And the rule of thumb was to inflate it, the total expense, by 25%. When Jane questioned whether that was honest, Ann said that even if the report, if they reported expenses exceeded actual expenses, the company owed them the extra money, given the long hours and the hard work that they put in. You know, that's something that a lot of people can try to justify. Well, I put in all this extra time. So Jane said that she did not believe that reporting the fictitious expense was the correct thing to do, and that she would simply report her actual expenses. Well, you can imagine how Ann thought about that, and she responded. She, of course, got angry, and she responded that to do that would expose all of the sales reps, and that basically, as long as everyone cooperated, the company would not question the expense vouchers. However, if one person, of course, started reporting only the actual expenses, the company would likely to investigate that discrepancy between the expense level and those of the others. And the other sales reps could lose their jobs. And so what she did was she appealed to Jane to follow the agreed-upon practice and tried saying that they would all be better off. No one would lose his or her job, and besides, the company really didn't need the money. So, you know, the question is, should Jane pad the expense report like the other sales reps? What we're going to do is we're going to go through a few different tests, and we're going to apply those tests to this scenario. And you can go ahead and apply them in your situation as well. So these are 3 tests. As I hope you can see at the bottom, I know where I received these from. And there's the smell test. There's many more. There's 9 tests. We're just picking out 3 because these are 3 that you could do pretty easily. There's the smell test, and we'll go through each of these, but there's the smell test, the justice test, and the character or virtue test. And so we're going to go ahead and we'll go to the next one, which is the smell test. Okay, the smell test. I don't know, maybe some of you have already done this. I know I kind of used to do this when I was growing up. What would mom think? You know, or whoever in your life is somebody who represents real ethics. Ask yourself also, you know, kind of similar to what Warren Buffett mentioned, asking yourself, what if I read this on the front page of the newspaper or in a blog? How would I feel if my family saw this? Now, the strengths of this test are that it really focuses on what other ethical people in society think, which is really good. It recognizes morality is about what other people think too. And it can enlist motions of shame, which can be a pretty powerful motivator. So it's a quick and dirty test, but let's take a look. So excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold here. Okay, so if we're going to go, oh, sorry, can you guys go back to the smell test? What we need to do is we're going to apply this situation. So if we applied Ann and Jane, Ann and the other reps, they don't want their actions publicized because they're concerned what other people might think, right, that they're lying or stealing, both of which society would condemn. So really we can come up with a pretty easy conclusion that padding is not ethical because the sales reps don't want it publicized, right? They would be willing to have accurate reporting publicized, but not that. Excuse me. Okay, so we can go, the next test we're going to look at is the justice test. And that's really asking yourself, is it a fair distribution of benefits and burdens? And interestingly, you know, we saw the philosophers of, you know, Calvin and Hobbes, but now here's a real true philosopher. Aristotle said, and this was more than 2,000 years ago when he said, equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally. Okay, well, really, what does that mean? And what are reasons for inequality? If we go to the next slide, we'll take a look at what are some of the reasons for inequality. So that can be effort, okay? Some people may have worked harder. So they may deserve more. Contribution. Some people may have contributed more to the group or to society, and therefore maybe they should receive more. There's also the need. Some people have greater needs to be served first or receive a larger share, and that's certainly something to be taken into consideration. Or there can be seniority. Some may have arrived in line first. They may be older. They may be younger. They may have more years of service, that whole seniority. And then there's the contract, which you can be seeing, in transit. All of these can really apply. Excuse me, a prior agreement about how the distribution should be made. So if you have that in a contract. So really, if you're going to apply the principle, you have to ask, so what really is the distribution? Who's getting the benefits and the burdens in the situation? Do those who get the benefits also share the burdens? Do those with benefits share some of the burden? These are factual questions. And once you know the distribution, you can decide really whether it's fair or not. And then you have to decide, is the distribution fair? But there you have to know which criterion for distribution would be most fair in the situation, and why would it be most fair in that situation. You have to be able to defend the distribution and the criterion for reason for the distribution. And really, step 3 is if there's disagreement over which outcome is fair or over which criterion for inequality is best in the situation, then you have to select a fair process to decide what's fair. That could be pretty tough. It can be an election. It can be a coin toss, rock, paper, scissors, whatever method you decide to use, and then you draw your conclusion. But with the justice test, there's strengths and weaknesses, but we'll go ahead and we're going to apply it to the situation. If we could go to the next slide, please. So if we're taking a look at the test, of course, there are strengths and weaknesses, but when we look at it in terms of those who may benefit and those with burdens, they would be allocated fairly. So those who may have benefits and burdens that would be allocated fairly are Jane and the other sales reps, the other employees, managers, and owners. The reps really seem to be getting the benefit of the extra pay, while the others have the burden of fewer resources, right? Is the distribution fair? The sales reps claim that the extra pay is fair because they work very hard. The extra pay for extra effort, right? And because their actual expenses are higher than the reimbursement system allows them to report, which is equality. These arguments might persuade the company to pay them more, but they have no way of knowing how hard the other workers work. And by taking extra pay without the company's knowledge, the sales reps are exercising an unequal share of power in wage negotiations, and they're really taking an unequal share in relation to the other workers who do not have expense accounts that they could actually pad for the extra pay. So we really can show that the conclusion would be, again, of course, padding their expense accounts gives the sales reps an unequal advantage in wage negotiations. They may claim they deserve the extra pay, but cannot prove that they do unless they actually negotiate openly with the company and allow other workers to do so also. They're maintaining an unfair advantage over the company and their fellow workers who do not have expense accounts. All workers should have equal chance to negotiate. When we take a look at the strengths and the weaknesses, the tough thing about this test is, the fairness, strength. Fairness is one of fundamental ethical instincts. Think of it as people know when somebody else is being treated more fairly. Even if you give little kids a sucker and one's larger than the other, they're quick to notice that. The weakness of the test is the test is really open to disagreement because there's really no single criterion for fair distribution. I mean, that's when it comes down to you guys trying to decide what should we use, and, even if you have to go to, again, rock, paper, scissors. So, I mean, there is some weaknesses to that. If we take a look at the next test, which is the character or virtue test, you're asking, does this action represent the kind of person I am or that I want to be? Does it represent my organization's reputation or vision? People want to have virtues or habits of acting in a certain way. So because it typically is still, companies want to be known for working well with people. Okay, so maintaining that character or virtue test. There's, of course, strengths and weaknesses to this. When we apply the actual test, the virtue character test, to our sales rep example, what we see is that if Jane, remember the new person, thinks of herself as a person who's honest and trustworthy in her business life, then padding her expense account on a regular basis will really weaken her habit of acting according to the pattern set out by those virtues or good ways of acting, which she believes in. Departing from her ideals in small increments really can make it easier to take larger steps later. And we see that, how that happens. People start out with just a little bit, and then all of a sudden it gets out of control. So if she would do this, giving the other sales reps time to change their reporting practices would strengthen her habit of becoming compassionate towards others. If she thinks that taking even one action against her ethical principles will damage her character by changing her expectations for herself, she should tell the other sales reps that she will file an accurate report and that they should change their practices as soon as possible to avoid being discovered by the company. Okay. I personally feel that that's what she needs to do, and to not even consider taking, with the small increments, take her in a wrong direction. I think it's important to make the right decision and act on it right away. So will the actions fit the company's reputation or vision of what it would like to be? Okay. So the company already indicated, right, in its training that it aspired to honesty in its employees' actions. Padding definitely goes against those aspirations. So it's pretty easy to conclude that padding would weaken Jane's habits of honesty, if we're looking at the tests, and trustworthiness, and it goes against the aspirations of the company. It's unethical for her to pad her expense account. And her habit of compassion may lead her to file one false report in order to give others an opportunity to reform. She needs to stick with what is the right thing to do. So when the strengths, it's really think about what's good. Not just a matter of following ethical rules, but really habits of acting in a certain way that society thinks are good. Things that good people should act. That's a real strength of this test. The weakness is psychological research shows that people don't always act in consistent ways in different situations, and there's research that shows, that some people may act generously because something smells good. They go into a bakery, and so they may act in a different way, or less generous if there's a lot of noise around them. So, there's some weaknesses to using this test, but it's still one that I think that you can walk through a process with to try to come with good conclusions. Okay, our next slide. What if you feel that you have not been ethical in past situations? This can be you or your company or a friend. One is really thinking tomorrow's a new day. Well, of course we can say, let's start right now. Let's start today. But there's also the tomorrow is a new day. People can change. Practice ethical situations. Develop a habit of ethics. And that's really, walk through different situations and scenarios and apply the test to them. Seek feedback from ethical people or role models. And so you may have to seek those people out. You may have somebody who's a really good friend, a coworker that makes ethical decisions. talk with them. I think if I have a sister, even when I know a situation's right, I often just talk with her because I really like her ethical frame of mind, and we have good conversations. Also, develop accountability. Think of ways that people that you could be accountable to. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk about growing in ethics. And there's a quote by Robert George. He's professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University. I liked his quote, that growing in ethics is a paradox. No one can do it for you, but at the same time, you cannot do it on your own. And that's where it's really important to seek that accountability and find that person that can really help you. And what would an accountability, what would this look like? What would an accountability partner or a group look like? It could be a local service organization, different affiliations. Look for people who you think make ethical decisions and what criteria they use. So hopefully you're thinking about what an accountability partner would look like for you, who that person would be, and to visit and talk with them. If we go to the next slide, we have some action. There's some action items listed here for you. I really encourage you to write out these 3 ethical tests and place them where you're going to see them. Now, for some people, that might be a sticky note that you put on your computer, and I would recommend, leaving it up there for the amount of time that you want. I know they say it takes 21 days to form a habit. I tend to like to go a little bit longer and that's why they have like 30-day challenges for things. Take it a little past that 21 days. But put that sticky note on your computer, write on a note card, put it in your wallet or in your purse, places where you can take it out and you can think about it. Your other action item is to find an accountability partner, someone with the high ethical standards. I can't emphasize this one enough. And then finally, reflect each day on how you handled situations. This is something that I'm teaching a leadership class as well, and one of the principles we talk about on becoming a better leader is to really reflect on each situation, but also reflect each day on how you handled situations, how you could have done them better, and the same with the ethics. Even if, right from wrong can be pretty clear. There's sometimes you just absolutely know right from wrong, and, despite you might choose wrong. But there's also times when there's right and right. And you want to figure out how can you choose the best solution. And that's how you can work on that, by really reflecting on the situations and circumstances that you address each day. So that actually ends, if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the resources, and then I'll just mention some of those. Doing the Right Thing, it's a 6-part exploration of ethics for families. It was a DVD series that Chuck Colson had worked on a time ago. The Ethics Resource Center, and these you can pretty much Google and you can find them. Ethics Resource Center, terrific, great resources there. The Markula Center for Applied Ethics, they have just a wealth of information. That's where I actually took the tests from their center, where I found them. Public Roads, they had some articles on ethics. Work by Brooke Hamilton, that also I found under the Markula Center. I have really just a host of literally drawers full of articles on ethics, and there's just a real wealth of information out there, and so I encourage you to dig into it. If you want to follow up with me afterwards, the next slide up does have my email and telephone number on, but I know we're going to have a little bit of time here for some questions if you have some that you would want us to address at this time. Otherwise, again, we can certainly follow up later. So with that, I thank you for taking the time and being part of the webinar.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for that great presentation. And we have received a couple questions. So if anyone else has a question to ask, again, feel free to type it into the questions area of your control panel, and we will answer those as we receive them. So, Jill, I sent you the first question, but I will in your chat box, but I'll also read it aloud. So, how would you address the situation of an employee who was otherwise exemplary and was caught having an unethical manner, and the response was, everyone else does it that way?
Okay, so an exemplary employee who was caught behaving in an unethical manner. Well, what I would do is address it with them first and say, you know, I think it ends up looking at, okay, is there a larger situation here? And so that's dealing with that employee right there. But then, because I'm not quite sure what this is, what the situation is, it sounds like it's going to be something that needs to be dealt with at a larger level. So if it's something that's happening in the organization, then if it takes a staff meeting or whatever it takes to bring it to the attention of the group and let them know that it's unacceptable. And then whatever goes along with, if there's some type of, for lack of a better term, punishment or however the company would decide to take action. But I think you can't just say, well, everybody else is doing it. It shows that you need to get at the root of the problem, and that is address it with that employee and then also address it with the others.
Great. Thank you so much. I sent you the next question, which is, do ethical questions have to always have a personal or financial gain, or can other situations lead to ethical situations?
You know, I think that's a very good question. Oftentimes, those are the ones that really get our attention, are the financial ones. And I think because we measure so many things monetarily, and that's one of the ways people try to get ahead is financial. It certainly does not. Ethical questions can come in many different forms, and I think many different situations. So can other situations lead to ethical situations? I would just have to say that whenever decisions, almost any time decisions are made, there can be ethical, unethical, or right, but more right answers. So it doesn't necessarily have to be financial gain, but typically there's some sort of gain in why it's unethical. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, here's kind of a follow-up to that, and perhaps people are wondering this, but what are typical ethical dilemmas that transit agencies are likely to face, or what kind of non-specific examples can you give that might be helpful for people to hear about in transit specifically?
Okay. Yeah. Some can be like reporting numbers, ridership numbers, to make sure to not inflate those in any way. Doing forecasts. There's quite a few articles on this where sometimes when communities are looking at adding another mode of transportation, and there's forecasts done, that sometimes those numbers may not be as representative. They may be inflated. So also with fares now, it's easier since there's, if there's electronic fare boxes or other certain fare boxes. But, counting the money, making sure that there's always a couple people there counting, and it's not just one person doing it. Those are supplies, even people using the supplies for things other than work, taking them home, using, let's say there's a vehicle, a transit vehicle, and they're using it for something outside of work. There can be somebody reporting their mileage going to a conference, and they don't accurately report that. So these are some that I've heard of in the transit industry that, definitely you can avoid them just by taking the time to make sure that you're very accurate in your reporting.
Okay, great.
Good question.
Here's another one. Who do you report an incident to that incorporates public officials?
No, yeah, that's definitely a challenging one. I think first, you have to make sure that you have all your facts straight is, one of the things that I would really encourage. Make sure that there are, that what you're reporting is actually an incident and you have all of your facts. And then it would depend on, which public official is it, because there's always somebody who's seems to be over them. And so I'm not sure which public official, if it would be, I may be speculating here, but if it is a commissioner, or probably go to like the mayor. And again, it's going to really depend on which office it is.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm sending you another one.
Okay.
So this is I guess, a hypothetical situation. The group knows that one employee is very unethical. However, the boss doesn't bring that employee to account. How can the group put a stop to the unethical behavior before the supreme leaders find out and deliver sanctions to the entire group?
Wow. Well, okay. Now, one thing would be the group knows that one employee is very unethical. Knows and documenting. I mean, it's crucial that so that the people, they may know it, but do they have actual facts? Do they have examples? And do they have proof? Now, the boss doesn't bring that employee to account. The one thing would be is, is the boss aware of all these facts? Has somebody gone in and said, this person did X, Y, and Z, and actual have proof, instead of, because there can be people who will just go in and say, oh yeah, I suppose so-and-so did such and such. Okay, so you've got to make sure that you have the facts. And then if the boss is not going to do something about it, you can try to address it with the specific individual. If it's just one person doing it, you can try to talk to them. And if they're not doing something and the boss is not doing something, I would take it to the next level of somebody who, like if there's HR at the company, an actual, the actual human resource office, that would have to be the place to go.
Okay, thank you. I think there's another question that was in that topic, but I think that answered it. But we can follow up with anyone after if you still feel like your question wasn't answered.
Okay.
Here's another one that I'm sending you. Can being mean be unethical? Also, is it unethical to let people who can't pay the fare ride the bus without paying?
Oh, okay. Well, I think being mean can be unethical. So they said, can being mean be unethical? I think being mean is just not nice. Now, is it unethical? Some people, okay, one thing that we did not bring up, but I'm just going to say, some people will call things a moral temptation, or they'll also call them ethical and unethical. It's a whole different school of thought that we did not get into here today in our short time. But so if we go by what we were talking about earlier, if there's a way that people think of what ethics are, and if it's really dealing with what's good and bad, if it's really a way to conduct yourself, then being mean, I'm putting out my opinion here, and another scholar could come and argue, but I tend to think of being mean as, I guess it could be categorized as being unethical. Is it unethical to let people who can't pay ride the bus without paying? I would say I would try to look at what does your agency or organization, what is their policy? Do they have any policy of allowing X number of rides for people? Is this who can't pay ride the bus without pay? The other thing would be if somebody cannot afford to pay, to try to look into programs that would be able to assist them with a bus pass or with paying, to not continually let somebody ride without paying. I think that's wrong. And so the degree you want to get involved to try to help that person because you know they're unable to ride is something that I would encourage. So it could be viewed, yes, unethical, but I see where that can be a hard one.
Here is one that was sort of related to another question, but we have some time, so I'll ask it. Do you have any advice when you know government senior management is doing something unethical? I want to go to the civil grand jury, but I'm afraid of retaliation. There is documentation of the unethical behavior.
Yeah. This is when it really comes down to what this person stands for, and I know you have to weigh out what's the retaliation going to be. And this ends up being a personal, I realize it's a personal decision. And when you know it and you have your facts, it of course seems like, trying to stop if there's corruption or something that you can fix or bring it to the light of day to take the proper procedure to do that. I recognize and I realize that there's some people who may not be willing to put, let's say, their family at risk to do something, if that's what the retaliation is. And that needs to be weighed out, but I tend to go in the sense of reporting what I need to report. I hope that answers it, because that is something that, unfortunately, one of the other things that can happen, you had asked earlier a question about what can happen at transit agencies. And, there can be cases when somebody who's on the board or somebody puts pressure on an agency to hire people that really shouldn't be hired. And, do you stand up to them and lose your job, or do you allow them to tell you what to do? Or do you blow the whistle on them? And, there's some people who will say, I have to feed my family, I'm going to go along with this. There's others, and I'm not saying that's right, but each person has, it's kind of deciding. I think the best thing is to always stand up for what's right and honest and honorable, and hold up your ethics and to not compromise.
Okay, great. this also, since we have a little more time, it's kind of a follow-up to the other question about, I guess so here's the question. What advice would you provide to organization staff if everyone except the agency manager or director is being held accountable for their actions? And I feel like you mentioned kind of going to a human resources department if there is one, but any other suggestions for this kind of situation?
So everyone is being held accountable except for the person who's the manager or the director of that organization. Okay, so if everyone's being held accountable and so they're all doing things correctly, but the manager or the director is not being held accountable and is doing things incorrectly, then it seems, again, you have to go to HR and report this so that things can be taken care of, because otherwise it seems as though they would not be.
Okay, thank you. And here's one last question before we wrap up. What if your agency's policy is curb to curb, talking about demand response or paratransit service, but a wheelchair client has no aid and needs a little more assistance? Is it unethical not to provide that extra assistance?
Oh, yeah. This is a tough one. This because I've heard of yes, I've heard of some of these issues. Yeah. You know, I've just got to say that's a hard one to answer, because it does seem unethical to not provide the extra assistance, but you're also, if your policy, so you have to question, is it illegal? Is it something that's illegal to do? What are the risks? I try to go through some of those tests and come out. You know, the smell test, it seems like it would pass, helping them because people would think they should be helped is one of the things I'm thinking. But it goes into taking a look at, make sure that you're looking at things in a legal way, and then also ethical and unethical. So if something's illegal to do and you're not supposed to do it, you have to be very careful because of consequences that could occur for your agency. And in which case, then I'd see if that person who is in the wheelchair, if they could receive assistance, if they have a neighbor or somebody that could help them, because the transit agency could be held responsible or liable for something, then I would encourage that to happen. I try to look for as many options to protect your agency from any liability.
Okay, I hope that was helpful.
And if people need further clarification, they certainly can contact me. I am not an attorney. I do have to say I am not an attorney. My background's in economics, so.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jill. Before we close, I if we could wanted to go over a couple things about, well, first of all, I think one more question came in, but we'll send that along to Jill and she will get back to you. And but that's all the time we have today. So these slides and a recording of the webinar will be posted on the webinars page of our website at nationalrtap.org, usually within a week, but we'll also post on Facebook about it and in e-news, so stay tuned for that if you missed the beginning. Also on that page, you'll find recordings of our previous 101 webinars, which include ADA, drug and alcohol, charter service, and social media. Some future topics for 101 webinars include the FTA bus safety program, tentatively scheduled for May, and Title VI programs. And finally, I want to put in a plug for our upcoming webinar about local agencies' experiences using GTFS Builder, which is one of our web builder tools, or web app tools. on April 14th. So you can find out more information and register on our website. And next slide, that is all. We just really want to thank Jill for a thought-provoking presentation today, and we hope it's been helpful for everyone. And just want to thank you all for joining us. We really hope to see you at our next one-on-one webinar. And thank you. Have a great rest of your day.